The Andes extend for 7,000 kilometers along the western edge of South America. The range is narrow but high. Peaks exceed 6,000 meters. Between Argentina and Chile, the mountains form a continuous barrier. In winter, snow covers the passes. In summer, glaciers remain at elevation. The air is thin. Weather systems move quickly. Visibility can drop to zero within minutes. In October 1972, the snowline sat at approximately 3,500 meters. Above that altitude, no vegetation grows. There are no animals. The terrain consists of rock, ice, and snow. The nearest human settlement on the Argentine side was an abandoned hotel 21 kilometers from a particular glacier in Mendoza province. On the Chilean side, valleys descend gradually westward toward the coast, but the distance from the high peaks to inhabited land is more than 80 kilometers. The Old Christians Club was an amateur rugby team from Montevideo, Uruguay. Most of the players were in their late teens or early 20s. Many came from the same schools. Several were studying medicine or law. They had been invited to play a match in Santiago, Chile, against an English rugby team called the Old Boys Club. The trip required crossing the Andes by air. Daniel Juan, the club president, chartered a Fairchild FH-227D twin turboprop aircraft from the Uruguayan Air Force. The plane could carry 40 passengers. There were extra seats, so players invited family and friends. 40 passengers and 5 crew members boarded the aircraft. The pilot, Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas, had 5,100 hours of flight experience. He had flown across the Andes 29 times. The co-pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Dante Hector Laguerara, was less experienced. Ferradas was training him on this flight. The Fairchild FH-227D was a stretched version of the standard model. An additional section had been added to the fuselage to increase passenger capacity from 52 to 56. The aircraft was 4 years old. Its nickname among pilots was the lead sled because it was considered underpowered for mountain flying. On October 12, the aircraft departed Carrasco International Airport in Montevideo. A storm front over the Andes forced an overnight stop in Mendoza, Argentina. Weather conditions over the mountains had not improved by the following morning, but forecasts predicted clearing by early afternoon. At 2:18 p.m. on Friday, October 13, the pilots took off from Mendoza. The direct route from Mendoza to Santiago crosses high peaks including Mount Aconcagua at nearly 7,000 meters. This route was close to the aircraft's maximum operating altitude. Standard procedure for turboprops was to fly a longer U-shaped route south to Malargüe, then west across Planchon Pass, then north toward Curacao before descending into Santiago. Planchon Pass has an elevation of 2,500 meters. This route added time but reduced altitude requirements. The flight encountered cloud cover over the mountains. The pilots were flying on instruments at 5,500 meters. At 3:21 p.m., shortly after crossing Planchon Pass, Laguerara radioed Santiago that he expected to reach Curacao in 1 minute. 3 minutes later, he radioed that the aircraft was overflying Curacao and turning north. He requested permission to descend. Air traffic control, which had no radar coverage of the area, authorized descent to 3,500 meters. Laguerara had made an error. The aircraft had not yet reached Curacao. It was still flying over the Andes, approximately 60 to 69 kilometers east of the position he believed he occupied. The VR/DME navigation radio displayed the bearing and distance to the Curacao beacon, but for reasons not determined, neither pilot noticed the reading. When Laguerara began the descent, the aircraft was still surrounded by peaks exceeding 4,000 meters. The plane dropped rapidly through turbulence. When it emerged from the clouds, passengers saw they were flying close to mountainsides. The pilots saw a ridge directly ahead. They applied full power and pulled the nose up. The aircraft climbed steeply but could not gain sufficient altitude. At 3:34 p.m., the lower section of the tail struck the ridge at approximately 4,200 meters. The impact severed the tail cone. 3 passengers, the navigator, and the flight attendant were lost. The rear section of the fuselage tore away. 2 more passengers fell through the opening. The aircraft continued forward. A rock outcropping tore off the left wing. Its propeller sliced through the cabin. 2 additional passengers were thrown out. The fuselage, now without wings or tail, slid down the glacier at 350 km/h. It descended 725 meters and struck a snowbank. The impact was sudden. Seats broke loose from the floor and compressed forward. The cockpit was crushed. Ferradas died instantly. Laguarara was critically injured. Of the 45 people on board, 12 died in the crash or within seconds afterward. The fuselage came to rest in a glacial cirque at an elevation of 3,675 meters. The location was in Mendoza Province, Argentina, 80 kilometers east of the flight's planned route. Snow surrounded the wreckage on all sides. Peaks rose in every direction. The temperature was below freezing. 33 passengers remained alive. Many had broken bones. The seats had compressed against the forward bulkhead, fracturing legs and ribs. 2 medical students, Roberto Canessa and Gustavo Zerbino, began treating the injured. They had no medical supplies. Nando Paradu had a fractured skull and remained unconscious. His mother had died in the crash. His 19-year-old sister Susana was severely injured but alive. Enrique Platero had a piece of metal embedded in his abdomen. When it was removed, part of his intestine came with it. He immediately began helping others. Laguarara, the co-pilot, was trapped in the crushed cockpit. He asked another passenger to find his pistol and shoot him. The request was refused. He died the following morning. During the first night, 4 more passengers died from their injuries. By the morning of October 14, 27 people remained alive. The survivors used luggage, broken seats, and snow to close off the rear opening of the fuselage. The shelter they constructed measured approximately 2.5 by 3 meters. Temperatures at night dropped to 30 degrees below zero. None of the passengers had cold weather clothing or high-altitude experience. Most had lived their entire lives near the ocean. Some had never seen snow before the flight. They found 3 pairs of sunglasses among the wreckage to prevent snow blindness. Fido Strauch devised a water collector using sheet metal retrieved from under the seats. It functioned as a solar still. He also fashioned crude sunglasses by cutting green plastic sun visors from the cockpit and attaching them to bra straps with electrical wire. Seat covers provided insulation. Seat cushions were used as makeshift snowshoes. Marcelo Perez, the rugby team captain, assumed a leadership role. The Chilean Air Search and Rescue Service was notified within an hour that the flight had not arrived. 4 aircraft began searching based on the last reported position. The search area covered both sides of the border. On the second day, 11 aircraft from Argentina, Chile, and Uruguay joined the search. Several planes flew directly over the crash site but did not see the wreckage. The white fuselage blended with the snow. Survivors tried to write an SOS message on the fuselage roof using lipstick but did not have enough to make letters visible from the air. They arranged luggage in the shape of a cross on the snow, but this also went unnoticed. After 8 days of searching, on October 21, rescue efforts were officially terminated. Authorities concluded that no one could have survived the crash in such conditions. Plans were made to resume the search in December after the snow melted to recover bodies. On the 11th day after the crash, survivors found a small transistor radio wedged between seats. Roy Harley fashioned a long antenna from electrical wire. That evening, they received a broadcast announcing that the search had been called off. The news was devastating. Gustavo Nikolic addressed the group. He said that the announcement was good news because it meant they would have to get out on their own. This statement prevented complete despair. The survivors had found limited food in the wreckage: 8 chocolate bars, 3 small jars of jam, a tin of mussels, a tin of almonds, a few dates, some candy, dried plums, and several bottles of wine. They rationed the supply carefully. It lasted 1 week. Paradu later described eating a single chocolate-covered peanut over 3 days. When the food was gone, they ate cotton stuffing from seat cushions and leather from belts and shoes. This made them ill. At an elevation above the tree line, there was no vegetation. No animals lived at that altitude. The bodies of those who had died lay preserved in the snow outside the fuselage. On approximately the 12th day, the survivors began discussing an option that no one wanted to consider. They were starving. Their own bodies were consuming muscle tissue to remain functional. They would soon become too weak to attempt any rescue effort. The decision to consume the flesh of the dead was not made quickly. Most of those who had died were friends, teammates, or relatives. All of the survivors were Roman Catholic. Some feared that eating human flesh would result in eternal damnation. Others compared it to the Eucharist. Some cited a passage from the Gospel of John, "No man has greater love than to lay down his life for his friends." They gave each other permission to use their bodies if they died. Canessa cut the first piece of flesh using a shard of broken windshield glass. He swallowed it first to set an example. Others followed over the next few days. A few continued to refuse. The flesh was dried in the sun to make it more tolerable. At first they could only eat muscle and fat. Later, as starvation worsened, they also consumed internal organs. On the 9th day, Susanna Paradou died from her injuries. Her brother had tried to keep her alive. He protected her body and his mother's body from being used as food. On October 29, 16 days after the crash, an avalanche struck the fuselage during the night. Snow poured through openings and filled the interior almost completely. 8 people were smothered: Enrique Platero, Liliana Methol, Gustavo Nicolich, Daniel Maspons, Juan Menendez, Diego Storm, Carlos Roque, and Marcelo Perez. The loss of Perez, who had been the group's leader, and Liliana Methol, who had cared for the injured, was particularly difficult. The avalanche buried the fuselage to within 1 meter of the ceiling. Survivors trapped inside realized they would suffocate. Paradou took a metal pole and broke through one of the cockpit windscreens, then poked a hole in the snow for air. On the morning of October 31, they tunneled from the cockpit to the surface, but a blizzard forced them back inside. The storm lasted 3 days. During that time, they remained trapped inside the fuselage with the bodies of those who had died in the avalanche. They began to eat the newly deceased. Paradou later described the flesh as soft and greasy, streaked with blood. He said he gagged when he put it in his mouth. When the blizzard ended, 19 people remained alive. Daniel Fernandez and cousins Eduardo and Fido Strauch assumed leadership. They took responsibility for harvesting flesh from the bodies and distributing it. As November progressed, the temperature began to rise slightly. The snow covering the fuselage started to melt. Some survivors began to discuss the possibility of climbing out of the mountains to seek help. Before he died, co-pilot Laguerara had repeatedly said the aircraft had overflown Curacao. Based on this statement, survivors believed Chile was only a few kilometers to the west. They did not know they had crashed 80 kilometers east of where the pilots thought they were. The Chilean countryside was not a short walk away. It was 89 kilometers to the west through high mountains and glaciers. Several attempts were made to explore the area around the crash site. Small groups ventured short distances but found only more snow and peaks. On November 15, Arturo Noguera died from his injuries. On November 18, Rafael Echeverrin died. On December 11, Numa Turcati died. He had been one of the strongest, but starvation and infection had weakened him. 17 people remained alive. It became clear that no one would survive unless they crossed the mountains. Nando Paradou and Roberto Canessa were selected to make the attempt. They spent days preparing. They fashioned warmer clothing by sewing together pieces of fabric. They created a sleeping bag from aircraft insulation material sewn into a tube. They gathered meat from the bodies to carry as food. On December 12, 60 days after the crash, Paradou, Canessa, and a third man named Antonio Vizintin began climbing west toward a ridge that overlooked the crash site. The climb took 3 days. The slope was steep, ranging from 30 to 60 degrees. They sank to their hips in the soft snow. They had no climbing equipment. The altitude was punishing. By the time they reached the ridge at 4,503 meters, Canessa had lost half his body weight, weighing 44 kilograms. When they reached the top and looked west, they did not see green valleys. They saw only more snow-covered peaks extending to the horizon. Paradou identified the tallest peak and decided it must be on the border with Chile. He told the others they would climb it. Vizintin, exhausted and unable to continue, returned to the fuselage. Paradou and Canessa continued west. They climbed the peak, descended the far side, and entered a narrow valley. They found the source of a river, which they followed. The water flowed west. This was the first indication they were moving in the correct direction. They walked for 7 more days. The terrain gradually descended. Snow gave way to rock, then to patches of vegetation. On the 9th day of their trek, December 20th, they saw a man on horseback on the opposite side of a river. The man was Sergio Catalan, a Chilean cattle herder. The noise of the river made communication impossible. Catalan rode away. Paradu and Canessa spent another night in the open, uncertain if they would be rescued. The following morning, Catalan returned. He threw a piece of paper and a pencil wrapped in a handkerchief across the river. Paradu wrote a note explaining that they were survivors of a plane crash in the mountains and that 14 others were still alive at the crash site. He threw the note back. Catalan rode to the nearest town and alerted authorities. On December 22, helicopters were dispatched to the crash site. Weather conditions allowed only 2 helicopters to reach the location. They evacuated 6 survivors that day. The remaining 8 were evacuated the following day, December 23. 72 days had passed since the crash. 16 of the original 45 passengers and crew had survived. The story became international news immediately. Initial reports focused on the fact of survival. When it became known that the survivors had eaten the flesh of the dead, public reaction was mixed. Some expressed horror. Others understood it as the only option available. The survivors held a press conference. Canessa stated that they had done what was necessary to stay alive. He said their friends and relatives had given their consent before dying. The Catholic Church in Montevideo issued a statement saying the survivors had committed no sin. The site of the crash remains at 3,675 meters in a remote section of the Andes. The wreckage was left where it came to rest. Snow and ice have covered most of it. The glacier continues to move slowly downhill. Pieces of the aircraft occasionally emerge from the ice further down the slope. The bodies of those who died were eventually recovered and returned to their families. Some were buried in Montevideo. Others in Santiago. Several survivors wrote accounts of the ordeal. Nando Paradu published a memoir in 2006 titled Miracle in the Andes. Canessa gave interviews but wrote less extensively. Other survivors chose not to discuss the experience publicly. In 1993, a film titled Alive was released, based on a book by Piers Paul Red. In 2024, a Spanish-language film titled Society of the Snow was released. Both films dramatized the events. What occurred in the Andes between October 13 and December 23, 1972, was survival maintained through systematic decisions made under conditions of extreme deprivation. The survivors did not possess special skills or training. They were young men and one woman, most in their early 20s, who found themselves in a situation for which no preparation existed. They adapted methods for obtaining water, insulating the shelter, and preventing snow blindness. When food sources were exhausted, they made a decision that violated deeply held beliefs in order to prevent death from starvation. The decision to consume human flesh was not made impulsively. It was discussed, debated, and delayed. When it was finally implemented, it was done with reluctance and revulsion. Those who participated did so because the alternative was certain death. Those who initially refused eventually relented as their bodies weakened. The practice continued for the entire 72 days because no other source of nutrition existed at that altitude. The 10-day trek by Paradu and Canessa covered 54 kilometers through terrain that included glaciers, steep rock faces, and high-altitude passes. They had no map, no compass, and no climbing equipment. They navigated by following water downhill. When they finally encountered Sergio Catalan, they were beyond the point of physical collapse. Catalan later said their appearance was shocking. They were emaciated, filthy, and barely able to stand. The survival of 16 people for 72 days above the snowline is documented in medical records, interview transcripts, and official reports. The initial crash killed 12 immediately. 5 more died within 24 hours. 1 died on the 9th day. 8 died in the avalanche on the 16th day. 3 more died over the following weeks from injuries, infection, and starvation. The last death occurred on December 11, 11 days before rescue. The youngest survivor was 19. The oldest was 26. They came from similar backgrounds and social circles. After the rescue, they maintained contact. Some became doctors. Others pursued different careers. Several spoke publicly about the experience. Others did not. The psychological effects of the ordeal varied. Some reported ongoing trauma. Others described the experience as transformative in ways they could not have predicted. Human endurance at extreme altitude without food is limited. The body consumes stored fat first, then muscle tissue. Cognitive function declines as the brain is deprived of glucose. Physical strength diminishes rapidly. After approximately 3 weeks without adequate nutrition, most individuals lose the ability to walk significant distances. The survivors remained functional for 72 days because they consumed protein and fat from the bodies of the deceased. This fact is unpleasant. It is also medical reality. What happened in the Andes in 1972 was not a story of triumph. It was a sequence of losses interrupted by brief periods of stability. The 16 who survived did so not because of exceptional strength or courage, but because they made decisions that allowed survival when those decisions became unavoidable. They did not want to eat the dead. They did not want to climb the mountains. They did not want to be there. They did what was required because the alternative was not acceptable. The crash site remains inaccessible for most of the year. In summer, mountaineers occasionally reach the location. Pieces of aluminum and plastic can still be found partially buried in the ice. The glacier has moved the wreckage several hundred meters from its original position. The ridge that Paradu and Canessa climbed is visible from the site. The distance appears short. The actual elevation gain is 839 meters over terrain that is nearly vertical in places. 72 days is 10 weeks. It is 2.5 months. It is a specific duration during which 17 individuals died and 16 survived. The difference between those outcomes was determined by injuries sustained in the crash, position within the fuselage during the avalanche, physical condition before the crash, and factors that cannot be fully identified. Some who were strong died. Some who were injured survived. The pattern does not suggest a clear logic. The event is often described using the language of miracles, but the term does not fit the facts. No external intervention occurred. No rescue arrived until survivors walked out of the mountains and led rescuers back. The 16 who lived did so by consuming the dead, melting snow for water, insulating themselves with fabric and aluminum, and maintaining enough physical function to avoid freezing during the nights. These are actions, not miracles. What remains is the fact of duration. 72 days at 3,600 meters without food, adequate shelter, or medical care. 16 people emerged alive. The distance they traveled to reach help was 54 kilometers. The ridge they climbed was 4,500 meters high. These are measurements. They describe what occurred. They do not explain it.